Good afternoon, and welcome to Writers Unplugged. This is a series that will air throughout the year in support of Cleveland Reads. Writers Unplugged is a chance to hear your favorite writers or new to you writers in conversation, as if you were eavesdropping on them in a coffee shop. Cleveland Reads is an initiative brought by Mayor Bibb to improve literacy levels in our community and encourage Clevelanders to fall in love with reading again by reading more books and more minutes this year. My name is Jen Jumba. I'm a librarian here at Cleveland Public Library. And one of my favorite things besides reading books is talking to those who wrote them. It's an opportunity to get to know their craft, what inspires their stories, where they like to write, essentially get to know them better and see them as human beings and not just the name on the spine of a book. And this afternoon, I am so incredibly lucky to be in conversation with writer, book critic, and librarian with her very own action figure, Nancy Pearl. You all are in for a treat this afternoon. But before we get started, I have a few housekeeping notes. To find out who else is visiting Writers Unplugged, both virtually and in person, like Lori Rader Day and Ann Cleaves next Monday at West Park, visit clevelandreads.com/unplugged to register. Max Beck's Books on Coventry is our wonderful independent local bookstore and has copies of Nancy's books for you. You can visit them in person or you can go to maxbacks.com. And then take a moment, let us know where you're watching us from and if you have questions for Nancy. And this is a brief introduction. Both personally and professionally, Nancy Pearl's life has been shaped by her love of books and reading. She was inspired by her children's librarians and went on to become a librarian herself. She earned her master's in library science from the University of Michigan, and she spent time working in public library systems in Detroit, Tulsa, and Seattle. She is retired as the executive director of the Washington Center for the Book at the Seattle Public Library and went on to write the Book Lust series, 4 titles filled with recommendations of good books to read. I think that's the favorite part of our job as librarians. In 2021, the National Book Foundation, presenter of the National Book Awards, named Nancy Pearl the recipient of the 2021 Literarian Award for Outstanding Service to the American Literary Community. She's won other awards and honors. She's the 50th recipient of the Women's National Book Association Award. She's received a Librarian of the Year Award from Library Journal, and she has a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association. Nancy's the creator of the internationally recognized Community Reads program, which began in 1998, If All Seattle Read the Same Book, and was the inspiration for the Archie McPhee Librarian action figure. She speaks about the pleasure of reading to literacy organizations, libraries, community groups, anyone she comes in contact with, regularly comments on books on KWGS. She hosts a monthly TV show on the Seattle channel, Book Lust with Nancy Pearl, and she has interviewed countless writers. She's also written a novel, George and Lizzy, which published in 2017, and most recently, The Writer's Library, The Authors You Love on the Books That Changed Their Lives, co-authored with Jeff Schwager. And I will tell you this as a personal aside, Nancy's the reason I'm a librarian. It was after meeting her in my previous career. We finished recording a radio feature, spent a lot of time talking about books. And at the end of the conversation, Nancy looked at me and said, Jen, you're a librarian and need to go to library school. And my life has completely changed. It is by far the most perfect career. So thanks to her and to Sari, I have a career that I absolutely love, and I have her to thank for that. So it's really kind of neat to come full circle, to be joined in conversation with someone who I watched talk to these writers. These books are on my bookshelves, and now the opportunity to talk to her about her books. So I'd like to offer a very grateful and a very warm welcome to Nancy Pearl.
Oh, Jen, thank you for that lovely introduction. Wow. Hardly recognize myself.
No, you are. I mean, how many people have not just one action figure, but 2? One has a cape, one is without a cape. So that is amazing. And this is like a different spin for you, because normally you're kind of where I'm sitting and you're talking to writers, but you have written George and Lizzy, The Writer's Library, Book Lust, Book Lust to Go, and then you're the subject of a picture book that is utterly charming about your life and how you ended up becoming a librarian. So I thought we'd start with your novel, right? Okay. George and Lizzy. So can you take us, kind of give us an idea of what the book's about in your own words?
So it's about a relationship of a young woman named Lizzy,
Mhm,
and she is as an undergraduate at the University of Michigan, actually,
mhm,
and she meets this dental student at a bowling alley. She's at the bowling alley with her roommate because Lizzie's heart has been broken by Jack,
yes.
and it's really the story of two people who are very different from one another, who look at the world very, very differently. Lizzy is definitely a pessimist, um,
Mhm,
and she comes by her pessimism honestly. And George is definitely an optimist, in fact, who makes a very good living helping other people um,
mhm.
with their issues in their lives. And it's really the first decade or so of their marriage. Um, and I have to say, in some ways, I wish that I hadn't published the book because I still think about it I think about George and Lizzy all the time. They're very, very real to me. All the
Yes.
characters in that book are very real to me. And I keep thinking of other things that I could have included, but it's too late now. So,
That's never too late. Do you ever see a follow-up to George and Lizzy?
there's a character in it named Maverick, who
Mhm.
is Lizzie's high school boyfriend.
Yes.
And I I think it would be I sometimes think about writing about Maverick and what his life has become. Um, I would set it I mean, have it all worked out in my head, which is how
Yeah.
I tend to write. Or I tend to I often don't get it down on paper, but it's all in my head. Um,
Yeah.
you know, I have figured out a way for Maverick, who was a professional football player, not very successful, to end up in Seattle. And if I set it in Seattle, then it could really I could make fun of everything about Seattle that's so make fun worthy. Um,
Right.
yeah, so I know a lot about Maverick and where he is now, but I have to say writing is so hard. And if you have to put aside all of your self-criticism.
Yeah.
The great temptation, or what would happen is, I'd write a sentence, and then I would criticize it. I would
Yeah.
write sort of an innocent sentence like Lizzy took George's arm. And then I would look at that sentence and then I would think, well, where did she take it? What did she do with it once she had it?
Yeah.
That kind of ridiculous way of dealing with that.
Now
So,
yeah. Does that critical part of your brain come from all the reading you've done and being able to appreciate it that way?
yeah, I think that's a very good way. I mean, I think I'm a naturally critical person, but it does come from all the reading. I mean, not only all the reading, but also all the years that I've spent thinking about and teaching about why people like the books they like or why
Yes.
they don't like the books they like. And George and Lizzy is a very, very character-driven novel. And the probably second most important thing about it is that it's a little bit quirky,
Yeah.
um, funny and sad and all of those things like life. Um,
Yes.
so I mean, I knew when I was writing George and Lizzy, I was writing it for me,
Mhm.
um, which I think is how you have to write. I think it's just deadly when you're writing to think about, oh, who might like this book? Or, think about,
Right.
is it ever going to be published? Or will my agent like it? Or whatever. You have to write it for you. And I'm a very particular kind of reader. And so I wrote a book that readers like me would really enjoy.
Well, it is splendid. I read it back in 2017 when it first came out, and then I reread it again in preparation for this visit, and somehow I thought, like, George and Lizzy, were still with me, but somehow I thought, like, it would end up differently, right? Because they're kind of etched in my brain, and, I've had several things happen since 2017, right? We all have. And so you start to think like, okay, look, George and Lizzy, like, what are they gonna do? And, it It is absolutely a wonderfully written book. And I've heard writers say that they write the book that they would want to read.
Right.
So,
Yeah. Yes. And I think that's really I think that you get the best books that way. But also I think really it's the only way to do it.
yeah. But because of that thick skin that you have to have, because
Yeah.
it's a piece of you, right? It's like it's a piece of art. So people who do paintings and you look at a Rothko, right? And how many people walk into the museum and go, "Oh, I could do that." Well, I don't
Mhm.
see yours hanging up there, but there's something like overly simplistic, or they look at a Mondrian, "Oh, I could do that. That's just squares and some color."
Right.
I don't
Right.
see, but like to be able to withstand, because people come to books sometimes so viscerally to what's presented.
Yeah.
But
And I think that one thing, I mean, I I don't read reviews of my books for sure. And I mean, everybody reads the same book, but reads a different book.
differently.
They
Mhm.
read it differently and they respond to it differently. And because of my career as a librarian and my career teaching about, what in the bookseller world we would call hand selling, and in the
Yes.
library world we would call reader's advisory, teaching about that
Yeah.
that everybody reads a different version of the same book. Um, I knew that there would be people who would like it, and I knew that there would be people who didn't like it, and that's fine. I mean,
Was
that's
that
what
the
life is.
Yeah. Was that the origin for What If Seattle all read the same book, so that everybody's life experience with that particular book, and then the shared discussions that you have around that book?
Yeah, I think that, the origin of that, which was started off with a very clunky name of If All Seattle Read the Same Book.
Yeah.
Back in 1998, we read Russell Banks' The Sweet Hereafter,
Oh,
which
good
was a
choice.
wonderful, wonderful book.
Yes.
Um, and I left the library in 2004, to sort of do freelance speaking and teaching and things like that. Um, and when I was in charge of it, when we came up with the idea, I mean, my idea was to choose books that made for good discussions. And there are a
Absolutely.
lot of books I think that you can love, but you don't have very much to say about it. And so, um, and the fact that people do read such different versions of the book, and
Mhm.
if you ask 10 people who have all read the same book to write a synopsis, one sentence synopsis of the book,
Mhm.
that would be that each one would be different from every other one.
Absolutely. And I think, at being a librarian as well, that's one of my favorite things is having those book discussions, right? And putting safety, that safe distance, right? To have difficult conversations sometimes about difficult topics, but with that safe distance of a book. It's a character that you're talking about, not the person across from you that is X, Y, and Z.
Right.
But I think that's the wonderful thing. And then, people start talking and you hear these amazing life experiences, and you're just better for it,
Yeah.
you know?
Yes. Yeah, totally. And I think that, um, one of the most, I think, impactful experiences of my life as a career was when I went to Bosnia in 1990, in 2007, I think. No, sometime in the 2000s, um, to do a cultural attaché at the American Embassy there decided to do a If All Bosnian Teens Read the
Oh,
Same Book.
okay.
And the book that they picked, before I came on board with the project, was Sherman Alexie's The Absolutely True Diary of a
I have a
Part-Time
part-time
Indian.
Indian.
And when she told me, when Sunshine, who was the cultural attaché, told me that was the book, I thought, well, how is that gonna? I mean, how is a Bosnian teen gonna resonate? I mean, what?
Yes.
I just didn't, like, I was surprised, but boy, was I wrong. That book
Mhm.
was perfect for those teens, because if you know anything about Bosnia, it's really a country divided into three different ethnic groups: the Muslims, the Serbs, and the Croats. And each one of those every teen is educated within its own group of fellow Croats or fellow Muslims or fellow Serbs, and there's no contact among the different teens. And they brought me there so I could do workshops for the adults who were going to lead the discussions with those teens.
Mm-hmm.
And in Sherman's book, at the end of Sherman's book, there's the main character, Arnold, I think his name is, I think I'm remembering correctly, makes a list of all the tribes that he belongs to. He's a Spokane Indian. He's a cartoonist.
Yes.
He's a 15-year-old masturbator. I mean, all of those
Yes.
different things. And so with every group, I would start out the workshop by saying, well, let's go around the room and say a tribe that we're all in,
Mm-hmm.
the tribe that you are in, each individual. And at the very first one, and I'll never forget this, I still get chills when I remember this. The very first woman who spoke said, I'm of the tribe with a Muslim mother and a Serbian father. And somebody else from across the room said, I'm in that tribe too. And there was this connection that these strangers made, and it wouldn't have come up. Believe me, you don't go around saying I had a Muslim mother and a Serbian father in Bosnia. And to me, that's the power of books. And that's what reading and discussion can. I mean, I've always believed that librarians make the world a better place. And, and they do now, Jen, because
I know. Now I'm one of them. Yeah, thanks to you. Huge thanks to you.
I take full credit for all of your success.
Yes, Sari might have some credit as well, but no, I'm certainly very, very lucky. I'm interested in this book, George and Lizzy, right? The structure that you don't have what is traditionally chapters. They're subject headings.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit?
Yeah. I partly that grew out of the fact that the book was basically written in my head, and I would tell myself stories about George and Lizzy every night to fall asleep. And so, sort of calming to think about, what George and Lizzy were doing and, how they met, what happened with Maverick, all of those kinds of things. And so when I finally sat down to write, basically it was just kind of putting down what was in my head and getting it down on paper. And when I first did the writing, when I first wrote the manuscript, because I was just emptying my head of all of these stories, which weren't in any narrative order or chronological order, the book came out with just these short chapters or short sections about different aspects. And the original manuscript had no, it had, I mean, people who didn't like it would say it had no rhyme or reason. It just, this is how it came out of Nancy's head with this. And I was fine with that. And I had sort of beta readers who were fine with that too. Yeah. But when my wonderful editor at Touchstone Books at Simon & Schuster, bought the manuscript, she called one day and she said, Nancy, I'm in my office and I have all those sections laid out on the floor and I'm trying to figure out a good way to put them in order. And she said, I came up with this idea of how about having a chronological order of George and Lizzy's relationship, and then mixed in with that, or among those chapters with George and Lizzy's relationship, then it could be really in any order that we want. And, I think that reading George and Lizzy, you get to know the characters in a way that is exactly how you get to know other people. Because when you meet somebody and you start talking to them, you don't get to know them in a chronological order. You get to know a little bit about them, and then you maybe have lunch with them the next, and then you learn a little bit more about them and that kind of thing. And I think that's what happens when you read when you read George and
Yes.
Lizzy.
It was just almost like an onion, like it just kept unfolding, like
Yeah,
layer after
right.
layer. I have 2 comments. Christine Geis says she has your action figure. And we have somebody, Victoria, who's joining us from Germany, from Frankfurt. And as a good librarian, she also has your action figure. So world renowned, right? This is
Yeah,
terrific.
yeah, yeah.
Um, but I do like the subject headings, the little like kind of
Mhm.
gives the framework. And there was one that what you remember and what you forget, that it just kind of struck me because there's a line that says with Lizzy, like can recall with an almost eerie quality. And then there's like you kind of against the opposite with like forgetting, right? And the influence with her relationship with George. Like she's absolutely like clear on something and then not so clear on other things.
Yeah,
So
and I think we tend to remember certain things with that kind of clarity, and
mhm,
then there are other things that, maybe somebody says, "Do you remember that?" And you have a vague
vague,
notion of that, but,
right?
um yeah, I think unfortunately Lizzy is the sort of person who remembers the bad things that happened to her in her life, but it's
Yeah.
hard for her to remember the good things.
But I like that she and George, I mean, it kind of, I guess you can either say like opposites attract because they really complement one another,
Mhm.
right? Like she kind of brings him to earth a little bit. And
Right.
at the same time, he kind of helps to lift her up because, I mean, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about her parents, but she did not have the
No.
nicest of upbringing.
Yes, her parents were two psychologists, and they were behaviorists,
Uh-huh.
and they saw the world as behavioral psychologists do, and sometimes I thought that I maybe had made it just too I I had been, I had made it too unrealistic,
Okay.
those 2 her parents, and then I was talking, was interviewed by, a writer who taught in the psychology department at one of the Big 10 universities, and I said, "Well, were you offended by what I said about psychologists?" And she said, "Are you kidding? Those people are in the department in which I teach." So, but they
Yeah.
were not very good parents, and, I do give a little bit of background of
Yes.
maybe why they were the way they are, but, um,
Yes.
I yeah, and it was fun. It was fun to describe the Thanksgiving, when George goes to
Yeah.
Lizzie's family's Thanksgiving, and, I I went to college in Ann Arbor at the University of
Yeah.
Michigan, and so I said it there, but George is from Tulsa,
Yes.
Oklahoma, and he did his undergraduate at Oklahoma State in Stillwater, which is where, my husband taught. So I had a
Okay.
lot to say about Stillwater, Oklahoma, where George went to college and his grandparents
Yeah.
lived. Yeah, and Lizzy, I mean, I think there's always something of the author in the books.
Okay.
Um, I think that Lizzy, is not me, certainly is not me. George is not anybody, those things that happened to them
Mhm.
didn't happen to me. But one of the things is that Lizzy has this wonderful best friend
Yes.
named Marla, and they
Yes.
meet, their first day of college and, remain best friends forever. And that was something that I didn't have, um,
Okay.
that I always wanted. So I gave Lizzy this wonderful best friend.
Aw. Yeah. That's yeah.
So, and I mean, I think that writers tend to do that. I mean, you borrow this and that from various people.
Mhm.
Yeah, so yeah, so that's George and Lizzy, and they are real people to me, and, Marla, Lizzie's best friend, is a real I think about what Marla's life is gonna be like now after the book ends, and
Absolutely. Yeah, because well, no spoilers, but
right,
yes,
right. Yeah.
I wonder too. And as I read it, I was like, God, what would Lizzie make of the pandemic?
Yeah,
There's just
right.
when you and this, I'm sure you'll maybe share a little bit with us, but I'm very character driven for books, right? And Julie McClelland is here from TCCL, and she's grateful for your training of books and how to look for them differently for her patrons. So we all are, but do you want to kind of share your 4 gateway secret?
Sure.
Well, not so secret anymore, but
right. So I've always thought, when I think about why people like the books they like, I think that people are looking for something in a book that they're reading. And let's call those doorways. When you open a book and you try to go into the book, you're looking for something. And the 4 different doorways or gateways, the first one would be the biggest one, the one that most people look for. And if you look at the New York Times Book Review, or you go into an airport bookstore, is story. And you could, if people talk about, if you say to somebody, tell me about a book that you liked, and they start telling you, I couldn't put it down, the pages kept turning, it was so exciting, all of those words, I mean, all of that, what you want to give them as a librarian or a bookseller is another book where the pages keep turning of themselves. And then the next biggest doorway for people, that is the next type of book that is probably most popular, are books that are character driven. Books, when you say to somebody, tell me about a book you like, they mention the characters. They might not tell you what the characters are doing or did, but they'll talk about how they seem so real, or they were just like their own family, or whatever. And you could first of all, if you're looking for a story-driven book in the library or a book or a bookstore, you can open up a book, and if there's a lot of white space on the page, it's a good indication of a story-driven book. Or if the chapters start halfway down the page and end halfway down the page, that's an example usually of a story-driven book. Similarly, if you're looking for a character-driven book, the best way to find a character-driven book, at least a book that in the eyes of the author and the editor was character-driven, is to look for a book in which the characters are the name of the book, the title of the book. Like George and Lizzy, or if they're descriptive of a book, Nick Hornby's About a Boy.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, so those are the 2 big ones, story and character. And then the third one is place, and I never thought that place, because it doesn't matter to me. I don't care. I mean, I'm not, all of that descriptive stuff is not necessarily what I'm looking for in a book. But I had a friend, I would say, she would come into work and I would say, oh, Martha, what are you reading? And she would say, oh, Nancy, I feel like I was there. And it's that there-ness that characterizes a place, a book in which place is the big doorway. And then lastly, and probably the least group of readers, but the readers who self-identify are to read for language, who when you say, I mean, they're the only people who will say, I like well-written books. And you don't even need to know how they're defining well-written. If they're describing their reading that way, you're looking for an award winner. So my reading is character and language.
Yes.
So, and yours is character, and you might need a little more plot than I do, but I'm pretty happy when there's no plot at all.
Right. No, and then I've become lately very driven by place. Like I just I read The Perfumist of Paris, Alka Joshi, and she does a wonderful job with the setting of India and what it's like, and the colors and the smells and the sounds, where you feel that you're there.
Right.
Some people are able, to do that, which is probably where book lust to go. That was a beautiful segue. Totally not
right. That was very good. That's
right.
Your radio background.
Well, I was just thinking radio and the library background comes together, but because there's so much you can learn from a book, right? And I'm totally intrigued. in George and Lizzy, I think one of my favorite things was the alphabet marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And for every single letter, they were like on complete opposites. I mean, from grapes, you know,
Right.
that Lizzy liked the green grapes with no seeds, and George liked the, you know, the grapes that were red with the
Right.
seeds. Like it's almost like they couldn't like agree on anything, but yet somehow they worked together.
Right.
You
Took them
know,
a while though.
it did take them a while.
Right. Right.
It did take them
They
a
do
while.
belong together for sure.
Absolutely, they do. Like, I'd love to see what happens to them next. I think
Yeah,
probably most of us would. So maybe,
maybe.
maybe, or
Maybe.
at least what we can have discussions about what we think they might be
Yeah,
doing.
right. Or
So
whether they're gonna even stay together.
I think yes.
For a long time, I thought no, but
Really, what
mhm.
changed your mind?
I guess what changed my mind is Marla's situation,
Mhm.
which kind of brought all that home.
Yeah, I think people who find each other and are lucky enough, you know,
Right,
probably don't want to give that up and start over again.
right, right. Yeah,
You know.
yeah.
So, I know like there are people, colleagues that are having bets with me as to whether or not I'll ask you about the inspiration for the great game.
Oh,
So,
the pre-game. So, so I mean, that was totally, totally invented. I think that most of us acted out in some way while we were teenagers.
absolutely.
And, you know, I certainly did not act out the way that Lizzie did,
No,
but, I think all of us probably act out one way or another as teens.
that's part of being a teen, right? Is you're trying
Yeah,
to figure out kind of who you are and kind of find your sense of self. So
right.
there are some acting outs and some, yeah, I
Yeah,
don't,
and it could be, you know, and I think that Lizzie's acting out was, you know, this sort of futile attempt to get her parents to notice, you know, to sort of see her as their daughter,
instead
um,
of a test subject
as a
from which,
test subject.
yeah,
Right,
it's almost like they had a child so they could just study the child
right.
rather
Yep,
than, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Hayden is joining us and saying that love Nancy Pearl and her work. When is her next book list coming out?
Oh, wow, yeah. So this is the 20th anniversary of the first book list,
Really?
2000, because the first one was published in 2003, which is when
Wow.
the first Librarian action figure came out, the
This
blue,
this one.
that
The
one.
one that's making the
The
shushing.
fishing noise, right, you got
Right.
it. Yeah, with the little button on the back that brings
Yes.
the arm up to make a little shushing noise.
Yeah.
And we all thought it would be really fun to do, we being me and the publisher of those books, which was Sasquatch Books,
Yeah.
thought it would be really fun to do a book list for the 21st century or something. But, you know, once again, Jen, it just, I feel like all the books that I loved are in those 4 book list books.
Yeah.
And to do a new one would just demand, so, and those basically I wrote sitting in, you know, a room in my house and looking at my bookshelves and, you know, thinking about, I mean, I don't have
So
that
it's
many books.
limited to one room?
Yeah, right.
No.
No, I have books in all the sort of loose alphabet
Yeah.
of
Right.
alphabetical order. It would just, you know, I started writing a new book list book, and then it just, for whatever reason, I don't know, it just wasn't fun. You know,
No,
it
and you should
just,
only do that which
and
is
just
fun.
exactly, right.
Good for
Yeah,
you.
yeah,
Yeah, well, we do, you know, we all as librarians and readers follow you, right, on Twitter to see what you're posting, not just like your like ridiculous ability to assemble jigsaw puzzles so quickly. Um, you know, done and dusted. I was like, again?
right.
Like this is
Right,
amazing.
right.
But then, you know, for recommendations, and then there are other books that, you know, I had kind of forgotten about that, you know, you bring back, you know,
Yeah,
which is really kind of neat.
yeah, thank you.
So no, it's, you know, I just wonder like of the stuff that's written today, you know, how, I don't know, it's just how different from what it was 20 years ago. So
Well, when I think about some of the books, some of the current books that I've really enjoyed reading, The Whalebone Theater by
Mhm.
Joanna Quinn, which I loved. Like many other people, I loved Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, the Gabriel
Mhm.
Zevin book.
Mhm.
I think I think that what I'm looking for now is just, well, those two books especially are so immersive,
Yes.
and that kind of, and I've always read to escape from when I
Okay.
was a little girl.
Mhm.
That was my way of dealing with my own unhappy family. Um,
Aw.
um, and so, even as an adult, I'm looking for those kinds of books, and those were two novels that really, I think, did a very, very good job of that.
I came to it late, and I don't know how, but the storied life of AJ Vickery,
Uh-huh.
right, which was
Right.
same
Gabriel
tomorrow,
Zevin.
tomorrow, and was like blown away. And kind of like always had in the back of my brain, maybe someday I'll write a book. Who knows? And then I was like, oh well, it'll just be like kind of. This is before I'd read the book. It'll kind of be defined by the book that I'm reading and the lesson that I learned and how I kind of applied it to what I was going through or whatever. And I was like, oh, no, done. Somebody already beat me to it several years ago, but was just struck by that. It goes back to what you said earlier, is that connection to books and what books do for you. It was an escape, as a child. And, we have to kind of mention
Yeah. Yeah.
Library Girl, right? That is just, yeah. What is
Yeah.
it like? What's it like to be the subject of a picture
Well,
book like that?
it always just feels like it's not really me. The author of that book is somebody that I've actually known for, 30, 35 years.
Yeah.
And, but she interviewed me for hours and, picked out certain events. And so everything in there happened.
Yeah.
There's a little part in there where the little girl in the book gets a ride to the library in the milkman's van.
Yeah.
That happened to me, our neighborhood milkman, Mr. Fishoff. I was supposed to take all my model horses to the library for a
Yeah.
display, and my mother didn't drive at that time. And my father, of course, was working and couldn't come and take me there. So my mother asked Mr. Fishoff if he would drive me to the library.
Yeah.
And, I didn't know he was a family friend. I mean, to me, he was just this stranger who delivered our
Yeah.
mail. So, I
Yeah.
went with him, but I was scared the whole time that he was actually going to kidnap me.
Yeah.
I think my mother maybe could have done a little bit better explaining to me that
True. Yeah.
he
A family friend.
a
Yeah, but I
family.
think, yeah. I think what I'm struck by is I think a lot of us who are librarians want to make sure that we are to this little girl or little boy that's in the library the same way the librarians were to you from your
Yeah,
childhood,
yep.
right?
And I
That it's
think,
a safe place to be.
yeah,
There's books, doesn't matter, like, and that's the fun thing, when new books come in and they go on the cart before they go on the shelf, like you can go down and like, okay, this is for Mrs. So and so likes this one's for this one. Like you automatically kind of know
yep,
what somebody's gonna like,
yes, yeah.
and that connection is just unbelievable.
I think one of the most interesting things is to think about why, when it's a book when you've read a book or part of a book, and you get to that point where you just don't want to finish it you
Hmm.
don't like that book. It's really interesting to me to figure out why you didn't like that book. Why you as an individual reader didn't like that particular book. I think a lot of it is mood. I think probably
Yes.
80% at least of why we like or don't like a book is the mood that we're
Yeah.
in. But I think it's especially for those of us who do book recommendations or book
Hmm.
suggestions, to think about what it was about this book that you didn't like. Like
Hmm.
maybe you would say, Jen, you might say, well, there's not enough. I didn't get any sense of place, or I might say the book wasn't well written enough, or
Hmm. Or the
um,
characters were flat, they were all
or the
good or
character.
all bad. Yeah.
Exactly, right.
Right.
Right. But then understanding too that you read for totally different reasons during the pandemic. Well, from,
Mhm.
during the pandemic, I basically read, I, I guess I would call them just
Mhm.
comfort reads. I did a ton of rereading. I read all of the Miss Silver mysteries by
Yeah.
Patricia Wentworth. And Miss Silver, for those who are unfamiliar with her, she's um, a spinster uh, detective, very much
Mhm.
like Miss Marple. So
Yeah.
fans of Miss Marple, Agatha Christie's Miss Marple, will really, I think, love the. I mean, they're just they're identical to the Miss Silver books. The only difference I've discovered, the only difference between Miss Silver and Miss Marple is that Miss Silver knits in the continental manner. So I had to
Yeah.
find out what the continental manner was, but that is the only difference. I mean, they're both solving mysteries, and I still am in that sort of place where I just want, I don't know, comfort reads, but I don't want, I don't want any horror. I don't want any, mysteries that are too, what I would call grungy. I
Mhm.
just want, I started a project of listening to all of the Agatha Christie
Yes.
mysteries.
Yeah.
So I'm almost done with that. And there are some that I wish I hadn't listened to. Poirot's Last Case. I mean, I
Oh.
didn't listen to them in any order. I just took whatever was available at the library. But Poirot's Last Case, Poirot is an old man in a wheelchair, and
Mm.
little gray cells, are still as active as ever. But, that was kind of sad to think of. That was the
Right.
last Agatha Christie book about him.
Yeah. Um, Marilyn says she calls them mind candy books, and they're what
Mhm.
she could handle during the pandemic. And then Julie says, I'm the same, too disturbing, or, through the pandemic.
Right.
Absolutely. I can remember meeting a writer at a conference, and I was starstruck, right? And, I was like, I love your books and your characters, and I'm not going to say any names because then I'm going to sound like a fool. But I was like, they're like whoobies. And she just looked, and I was like, the really comfortable things that you put on when you've had a bad day and you make a cup of tea, and she's like, oh, perfect. That's what I write in. And I was like, oh my God, so gracious. But like that same sense of comfort, that knowing what to expect from a series, right?
Right.
I think does that probably more, I don't know, more so than standalones. I don't.
No, I think so. I mean, I think I think I taught a class for a number of years called adult. What was it called? I think it was called something about genres. But I spent the whole time trying to convince. I mean, I think that labeling books in different genres does a disservice to the reader and the
Mhm.
writer, and that readers would be library users don't agree with me because they like to have the mysteries in a section. And
And it's only mystery writers that revolt. Like
yeah,
romance writers and women's fiction, contemporary fiction, classics doesn't matter. It's the mystery readers that
readers.
revolt in
Yep, yep,
libraries.
yep. But I think you
Yeah.
can get in a mystery. When I think about the mysteries that I love,
Mhm.
um, I love them for exactly the same reason for any other book, that they're
Mhm.
nicely written and the characters are great. So
Absolutely. So, um, I'm trying to think about what else to ask you. Before we go to, you guys can see
the
this is the
writers'
writer's library. Because I think it kind of, since we're talking a little bit about the pandemic, I think that was the thing that caught people's eye. Like I'm looking behind you and I'm like, ooh, what's on Nancy's bookshelf?
right.
What's she reading? Right. So you did this amazing project with Jeff Schwager to talk to writers to find out what influences them and then put it all in this amazing book and audio, which was terrific to listen
Yeah,
to.
yeah. The
Were there
audio
any,
was fun.
yeah, were
Yeah.
there any surprises? People that
Um,
you interviewed
so
that you were surprised that that was the book that they were.
Well, we went to, except for one interview, which was done over email.
Mhm.
Sadly, I wish it hadn't been. I wish we could have done that one in person. Every other interview,
Yeah.
Jeff and I went to those people's house, or Dave
Mhm.
Eggers, we went to his
Oh, his writing.
HU6,
Yeah.
his writing, what would you call it? Kids writing studio
Yeah,
or
but because of where it is, it has to be retail, so they sell, like, pirate
yeah,
supplies or
yes, yeah,
yeah,
pirate
he's
supplies.
he's a
Yeah,
genius. Yeah.
yes. And we interviewed his wife at a bookstore in San Francisco. And so we interviewed, I mean, it's a great list of writers. I
Yes.
think, both writers that people are familiar with, might be familiar with, but also writers that are that I hope that Jeff and I hope are unfamiliar, but
Yes.
will become familiar through that experience of reading. And we wanted to interview the writers not about their own books, but about the books that made them the people that they are. And it was just fascinating. I mean, we went to Michael Chabon and
Mhm.
Ayelet Waldman's home in the Berkeley Hills,
Mhm.
although not very high up in the Berkeley Hills, kind of a little bit up in the Berkeley
Yeah.
Hills. And we sat around their dining room table and drank tea and talked about children's books. And you
Yeah.
just sort of get a great sense of what Michael and Ayelet's relationship is like, but also their great love of reading and how they've really
Yeah.
passed it on to their children. Amor Tolls, we were at his home. Jennifer Egan, I'm
Yeah.
thinking of New York writers that we talked to. I mean, it was just
That's
really,
incredible.
yeah, it was Louise Erdrich. We interviewed at her bookstore, Birch
Yeah.
Bark Books in Edina, Minnesota. I think I might
Yeah.
be pronouncing that wrong. So that was really great. And and then the pandemic came and we couldn't do a book tour, which we had all these lovely ideas to, you know,
Yeah.
do it in places where maybe we could bring the authors on
Oh, absolutely.
well. So, but if that's the worst thing that happened to anybody during the pandemic,
Yeah.
that's pretty good.
That is pretty good. Can we ask, or can I ask, what books shaped you?
Um, So Miss Whitehead, my librarian at the
Mhm.
my main librarian at the Parkland Library, who really was why I became a librarian. Miss Whitehead was Canadian, and she recommended, gave me all the British children's books, The Wind in the Willows and The
Yes.
Children of Green Noe or whatever,
Yeah.
Enid Blyton, just all of those books. And because of that, I'm convinced that's why I am the Anglophile that I
Yeah.
am to this day. But she also had me read all of the Newbery Award books.
Okay.
Um, and one of the books that just made so much of an impression on me was Johnny Tremain by Esther Forbes. And it's
Okay.
very hard these days, I suspect, to get a kid to read Johnny Tremain because it's dense and it's
Mhm.
very narrative heavy, but it's a terrific portrait of the American Revolution and the
Yes.
characters. You meet Paul Revere. In fact, the main character, Johnny Tremain, is an apprentice, Paul Revere's apprentice. And um, and Esther Forbes, the author, wrote that book after she had written a Pulitzer Prize winning biography of Paul Revere. And she had all of this research that she had done and she
Yeah.
didn't want to lose it. So she wrote Johnny Tremain. And that
Wow.
turned me into someone who loves historical fiction.
Yeah.
And, I went on to get a master's degree in history and thought that maybe I would get a doctorate in history and that my dissertation would be on teaching history through children's books, but which I'm sure somebody has done. But but then I realized I'm really not an academic type of person, and that's not what I want to do.
Right.
So those were really formative books for me. Miss Hickory
Mhm.
broke my heart when I read it.
Bridge
I
to Terabithia was the one that broke
Richard
my heart. I
Garrett,
can remember sobbing
yes,
after
yeah,
I read it and
yeah,
just was like and then I'm thinking like those you have, and most writers have access to the same words that I do,
right,
but somehow you put them together in an order that constructs this character
yeah,
that just lives in your heart like
yeah,
forever because
yeah,
of a book that you read and a story and how they acted.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a book like was a children's book for little older kids, young teens, called May I Cross Your Golden River, which has a similar plot to The Bridge to Terabithia. And I was once trying to describe that to somebody when I was working in the bookstore when the book had just come out. And I just started weeping
Mhm.
because it was so, so moving. Oh my
Absolutely.
goodness. Yeah.
And that's the beauty of books, right? Like
Yes.
that
Yes.
they can get you like right here,
Yep. Yeah.
and then characters, and I'm sure besides George and Lizzie, there's other books that you've read over the course of your life
Oh,
that
yeah.
forever live here, and there are
Right.
times where you're like, well, what would so and so do?
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
what would they
Yes.
think of all of
Right.
this? You
Yeah.
know?
Yep. Yeah.
So,
How can I mean, there was a time when I got locked in a bathroom at an old hotel in Portland, Oregon, the
oh no.
Maverick Hotel, and, rather than panicking,
Uh-huh.
which would have been my normal response, I thought, "Well, what would Nancy Drew do? She
Uh-huh.
would get herself out of this," which I did, I have to say.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think it's awesome. I think there was an incident at a library where something happened and I made a comment to the officers. I was like, "Well, such and such and such." And they're like, "Look at you, Nancy Drew." And I was like, I took that as a compliment. They were trying to be funny and I was like, "Oh, that's high praise."
Oh,
Right?
that's
'Cause it
great.
was Nancy Drew and it was Trixie Belden,
Right.
that I
Yeah.
loved, you know?
Now, Jen, that means you have to read a book called The Confessions of a Teen Sleuth,
Okay. I'm
and,
writing it down.
yes, yes, you must read it because it is the real biography. It is written by the real Nancy Drew, and Trixie Belden is one of the characters, as are the Hardy
Hardy
Boys.
Boys. Oh, see,
Oh,
then you
yeah.
have the trifecta right there.
Yeah, yep, yep, totally. Oh my
Uh,
gosh, you've got to read that book.
Oh, I definitely will. You have not ever steered me wrong. You were the one that introduced me to Flavia,
Oh, yeah,
Sweetness at the Bottom of the Pie,
yeah,
and that whole
yeah,
series, which I absolutely adore. I mean, her bike has a name. I think that
yep,
somebody else
yep,
as a
yep,
kid had
yep.
a bike that had a
That's
name.
it. Yeah,
So,
totally,
yeah. So lots of
totally
great
good.
stuff. I think the very first book after we first met and recorded those radio features was The Lotus Eaters.
Uh-huh.
And then I was like, there's a sense of place. Like,
Oh my gosh, yes,
yeah,
Vietnam. Yep,
yeah.
yep. Yeah,
So,
that's a wonderful, wonderful book. Tatiana Soli is
and I can remember like, okay, well, she told me to read it. And I was like, how did she know that's exactly the
yeah,
right book for me to read? Like that's
yeah,
the genius, and knowing,
yeah.
mood as well as what's going
'Cause
to
we had
resonate.
talked about books, and I knew you wanted character
Uh-huh.
and that's so well written, so beautifully written, and such a good book. Yeah,
Absolutely.
yep.
We are, yeah, as we're wrapping up here, my gosh, I could talk to you like the whole rest of the day, and I think we would have lots more people join us as well. So let's talk a little bit about literacy, just because this
Sure.
is part of Cleveland
Yes.
Reads, where we're kind of trying to help improve literacy levels around the city. Can you share a little bit about why literacy is important to you?
I can't imagine a life for me, literacy is not just learning to read, but part of literacy, I think, is learning the joy of reading.
Hmm.
And you know, because I'm a librarian and because, I went to college and I have a graduate degree, people always think that I came from a family that was very highly educated. And in fact, my father didn't, he dropped out of school when he was in the 8th grade. I mean, he was a reader, always a
Mhm.
reader, but he finally went back and got his GED when he was in his 70s. And I think that what reading does is I really believe that it brings people together. And I know, Jen, you're now in charge of the People's University,
Yeah,
and
well, yeah.
oh, is it?
Yeah, actually now for the popular collection at the
Okay,
main library.
okay.
Yeah.
So for me,
Mhm.
what reading does is the fact that the library, the old library in DC, in the District of Columbia, is one of those beautiful marble,
Mhm.
sort of standard libraries,
Yeah.
and across the top it said the People's University.
Right.
And to me, that's what a
Mhm.
library is, and and always has been. And so for people who can't participate in that joy,
Mhm.
um, I think it's I think reading helps you be I think I think reading is necessary to be a good citizen,
Mhm.
actually.
Yeah, the Cleveland Public Library, the main building is almost 100 years old. So it has the marble and the beautiful
Mhm.
stained glass and beautiful frescoes on the walls and the ceilings. Um, and it's the same thing. It's a People's University. It was one of the first libraries that had open shelves, where way back when you used to have to request what book that you wanted. And anybody who's a reader knows, like, the beauty is you go in for one book and you come out with like five
Right.
more that you didn't know you had to read.
Right,
Right. But
exactly.
there's the
Yeah,
beauty in that.
yes.
And it's the one last place where, doesn't
Everyone, yes.
everyone is welcome,
Yeah. It's
Um,
it's the last democratic, small d democratic
yes.
institution in
Yeah.
a community, and it's the center, it's the heartbeat of a community, is the public library,
Right.
and does
Maryland.
nothing but good.
Well, yes, absolutely. Marilyn is chiming into your Johnny Tremaine comment with, in the fourth grade, Let There Be Light. And then somebody wants to know the name of the book that you just recommended, which is Confessions of a Teen Sleuth.
Yes.
So
Confessions of
Mr.
a Teen Sleuth.
2248. Um, so yeah, so we'll wrap up with the
Okay.
final 5 questions, right?
Okay.
Who have you not interviewed that you would love to interview?
Oh, oh my gosh, who have I not interviewed? I would have loved to have interviewed um, Toni Morrison.
Mhm.
I would have, I interviewed one of my all-time favorite writers, Terry Pratchett,
Yes.
a long time ago, and I would have loved to interview him again, because I was so much in love with his books that I think my students, when they saw the interview, just said, "Oh, Nancy, it was disgusting. You just fawned all over him." Uh, and, I would have loved to. I mean, it was a fine interview, but there are so
Mhm.
many more questions that I think now I would have loved to ask him.
I was fortunate enough several years ago to hear Toni Morrison speak. She has a connection to Oberlin, which is not far
Mhm.
from me, and a bench in her name.
Wow.
So yeah,
Yeah.
pretty incredible. Um, let's think. Do you have a favorite music group or band that you
Oh,
listen to?
I listened to not yet. I mean, I like Jason. Well, the music I like is because they're stories,
Country.
actually. So Jason Isbell, I like
Yes.
his music. Sugarland, I
Oh,
like
I love
their
Sugarland.
music.
Jennifer Nettles.
Yeah,
Yep.
yep. I love their music. But Lucinda Williams. I
Yeah,
love Lucinda
absolutely.
Williams. Yeah,
It's just kind of fun. You're coming out of Seattle, so I'm not hearing Nirvana. I'm not
I
hearing
know.
Pearl
I know.
Jam or
I
Soundgarden
think
or
I was too old. I think I was
no, I don't
too
think so.
old.
What sports team do you closely follow?
The Golden State Warriors, but
Mm,
in my heart, I'm always rooting for every, Detroit team, but,
gotcha. Yeah,
yeah.
the Guardians are playing Detroit today, like a
Ah,
doubleheader. They got like rained out or snowed out yesterday. I'm not sure which, because it
ah,
was snowing here. So
wow. Yeah, yeah.
um,
Well, Golden State is down 2 games to the Sacramento Kings.
I know, but there's Steph Curry,
I
so
know, I
you
know, and
know,
Steve Kerr, I've always
yeah,
felt
he's a
Steve
good,
Kerr
solid.
should run for president. I would vote for him in an
Oh,
instant.
I'd vote for him for anything, quite frankly. President of ALA, right?
Yeah,
Um,
right.
what book do you think everybody should read? I know you,
Okay,
without
so I
spoilers.
think that I think that the book that the most people would enjoy
Mhm.
would enjoy is Larry McMurtry's Lonesome Dove, because it has all 4 of those doorways that we talked about earlier. You know, unforgettable characters, a page turner of a story.
Yeah.
The setting, I have to say, when you're reading Lonesome Dove, which is the story of a cattle drive, you really need to have, you know, a bottle of water with you, because the dust from that cattle drive and the
Yes.
heat will just dry up your throat, something awful. So you need water
Yeah.
all the time. And then, you know, won the Pulitzer Prize. So
Yeah.
the writing is not the big thing in that book, but gosh, what a good book.
Yeah. Betty says, thank you so much for the chance to meet one of her heroes. And a huge thanks for the work that you're doing with librarianship and promoting literacy all over the world. And Julie said she was just talking about Lonesome Dove yesterday to a customer.
Good.
So awesome. And then which writer would you take on a road trip?
Oh my God, which writer would I? Well, I think I would. Well, somebody else that I would have loved to interview is Lori Moore.
Okay.
Because I love, love, love her short stories, and especially that collection called Birds of America. So it'd be really interesting. I mean, I think Amor Tolls would be fabulous to go on a
Yes.
road trip with. I mean, every
Absolutely.
sentence that he, you know, says is like
Oh,
gorgeous.
shoot. Yeah, I know. I'd read his grocery list, or,
Right.
you know.
Yes. Right. Right.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I just want to say thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I want to say thank you to the Cleveland Public Library tech team for making sure everything looks good, sounded good. A huge thank you to Erica Marks, who made this series possible. May you all be fortunate in life to have somebody who has a conversation and then things become a reality. Both Nancy Pearl making me a librarian and Erica for making this series come true. And then thank you all for reading and sharing that love of reading with one another. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you.